Hello, viewers. Thank you for joining us for another Across the Pond webcast, or like our boss calls it, Across the Pondcast. I'm Lindsey Stroud. I'm director of the Consumer Center at the Taxpayer Protection Alliance, and I'm host of this weekly webinar with my co-host, Martin Kulip, who is actually across the pond, hence the name of the podcast. And Martin, I'm just going to let you introduce yourself and say hey to the people.
Hi, I'm Martin. I'm International Fellow at the Taxpayers Protection Alliance, based, as Lindsey said, in South London. Good to be here, the third podcast.
Yes, we're coming along. And today we have an awesome guest. We are joined by Yaël Ossowski. He's writer, radio host, and deputy director at the Consumer Choice Center. Yaël, thank you for joining us. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, I'm a big fan of both you, Lindsey, and also our dear man Martin here in the UK. So thank you guys for having me on the Pondcast. So yes, Yaël Ossowski. I've been doing writing, reporting, investigative research, probably the last 10 years or so in various media, both newspapers, online media, television, the like. And basically the last 4 or 5 years, I've been heading up many of our programs at the Consumer Choice Center. So speaking to consumers who like lifestyle freedom, they like innovative technology and smart policies. So that's what we do, not just in the US and Canada, but across Europe, across Latin America, and then parts of Asia as well.
I was checking it out earlier today, and your website's a little bit hard to navigate because I get different. Google automatically wants to like detect the first language, and then going down, it's really hard to get to some of the articles. Can you tell us some of the issue areas that you guys are? Well, actually, we'll just start from the beginning. How did the Consumer Choice Center like come about, and what were the issue areas? I guess then that you guys felt that there was this need to give this analysis to and empower consumers.
Back to the origin story, right? Everyone needs an origin story. Ours goes back to the taxi strike in Germany. I believe that was back in 2015, 2016. And there were a lot of taxi drivers who were striking because of this great new technological alternative that arrives on our smartphones known as Uber. And Uber was making its entry into various European markets. People like myself and many of my friends and colleagues were using it like crazy incessantly. We were saving money. We were able to find better, cheaper rides. It was safer. There was a rating system. Everything about it we loved. And there are so many other people like us. And then we saw that there were these large rebellions by taxi drivers, by unions, and they had a lot of success in blocking traffic and in blocking access and getting some of these apps shut down. And there was no one standing up for the average, everyday technological user who actually likes this stuff, who likes things like the sharing economy. And that was sort of the beginning where we saw that there was a market for people who don't feel they're represented by traditional consumer groups. Because most consumer groups, as you might know, basically they're in the business of trying to shut things down, to restrict companies, to make sure that we have more bans, more restrictions, and more regulations. And no one's really standing up for innovation and for great technology and how it's actually improving our lives. So it started there in Germany. Some of my colleagues went out there with signs. The taxi monopoly is so yesterday. And now it's evolved into sort of a full-fledged operation. We have colleagues who are working in Europe, in the US and Canada and Brazil and India, throughout Latin America and parts of Africa. And the entire message stays the same. It's all about lifestyle freedom, innovative technologies, and everything related to smart consumer policies. So it started off with the sharing economy, something we're still very passionate about. And we do an index sort of every few months to rank all the global cities and who has the best sharing economy services and laws, but also things like vaping and harm reduction, very important. The smart legalization of cannabis, I think, is a very important one. Talking about digital policies and everything related to monopolies in the United States and what the crackdowns are by government. But then also looking at subsidies and where we can eliminate subsidies and make sure that consumers have fair, better prices, and we allow for more innovation. So there we've been very, very active. There's so many other debates and things that we've weighed in on, and it's very fun to try to get involved in a lot of this because we're a global organization. And for us, what is I think so fascinating is that the impulse to restrict and to ban is very global, and they often take a lot of their cues from different jurisdictions in different countries. So we're hoping to use some of those examples, turn them on their head, and hopefully have a more consumer-friendly model in many of these countries where we're active.
I'd like to pick on it's not just the global nature of it, it's a historic thing with prohibitionists, isn't it? It's just something through the ages that you always get a certain type of person who wants to prohibit something. And generally, it doesn't come out in favor of the consumer. It's always the consumer who seems to lose out with these things. I mean, you can go back, for example, for the candle makers opposing electricity coming in, but who would do without electricity now? You know, these things have gone on for a long time as well. And I'd like to say, you know, back then, maybe it would be just restricted to a certain jurisdiction. But do you think now the global nature of it, like you said, you get one country say, well, they banned this in that country, we should do the same here. Do you think that increases the force of the prohibitionists, and we've got to kind of gang up together globally as well to fight against them?
Well, I like the Bastia reference of the candle makers. But specifically with, you know, these kind of projects, I mean, we have these insular examples of alcohol prohibition in the United States, you know, carried on by the Anti-Saloon League and many other civil society groups at the time. But even in modern day, you know, we had bans on alcohol, tobacco, vaping products in South Africa, you know, during the pandemic, and it shut down all these stores, reduced access. And now we really see that a lot of it is being filtered by a lot of money, buckets and buckets of money. Money is being poured into different organizations related to the World Health Organization. There are different civil society groups that carry on in Latin America or throughout Southeast Asia. And a lot of it is being funded by not just, you know, your tax dollars and my tax dollars, but also some billionaire dollars. We have Michael Bloomberg as a very good example, swashbuckling former mayor of New York City, a failed presidential candidate, and has used billions of dollars to try to impact policy, particularly on harm reduction and vaping in Southeast Asia, across Latin America. And that money, whenever it's presented to a developing country, means a lot. And it means that they're ready and willing to pass a ban or restriction or do what they say. So when Mayor Big Gulp comes to town, a lot of people are going to pay attention, and they're going to turn over their rules and regulations. And that's how it's become a lot more internationalized. When we have bad examples of people who ban certain products in various countries, many of us can laugh and sneer all we want, but that stuff is pretty global. And the people who work on this stuff, the architects of these policies, they have power, and they have power in the halls of the UN. They have power in the halls of the World Health Organization. And when we look at the pandemic and what's happened there, all of the eggs that were put in the basket of non-communicable diseases, of everything related to vaping and video games and all of this, that meant that they had their eye off the ball when you had a real pandemic. When you had COVID, you had something actually they could address, and they failed at that. And I think that's what's kind of happening in many of these areas, is many of the international health bureaucrats are simply too busy focusing on all the problems that they would like to solve for us, which take away our individual rights, and would rather focus on the things that are, you know, basically the smaller things in life, instead of the actual pandemics and the actual health crises that affect us all.
How did I know Bloomberg was going to get brought up? Of course. I've been doing research on him. And so I imagine that the Consumer Choice Center has, like, I only started on this, so you guys have been around for a way longer time. But it's so interesting to see how much he encompasses consumer issues. And it's like, if you take everything that he did in New York City, he's done it across the world, whether it was, you know, smoking bans, cigarette taxes, the you know, calorie, you know, counts, you know, advertisement, you know, menu the requirements, you know, when you go out to eat, the soda tax. I mean, that one, I'm still floored with what he did here in Cook County and how much money that he had spent on that one. But it was interesting if you look at like everything he's done in Mexico. It's like, wow. I mean, and so to see him go for so many other you know, countries and do that, and you're right, when you bring in that much money, you know, it is intriguing. I mean, look at the Philippines FDA right now. I mean, under a lot of scrutiny for like taking that money themselves. And but are there any other, like, when you guys are doing your research, is there any other billionaire besides, I mean, okay, yeah, Bill Melinda Gates Foundation is, you know, usually associated with it, but like Bezos or like any of these other like billionaires, you know, who's the Virgin guy? I can't think of his name right now, but, you know, I mean, are they as heavily involved with trying to shape policies like this across the world?
Well, yeah, it's Richard Branson at Virgin. Well, him and Bezos, you know, they focus on other endeavors. You know, they're focusing on space, sometimes the rainforest, many more environmental organizations. And I think that is something that all of us care about. And there are certain ways and more effective ways that we can do that. But specifically with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and with Bloomberg, they have focused a lot on these kind of personal health issues. And I think the worst part of it is, if this were any other billionaire under any other name affiliated with any other political party that came from the United States, people would decry it. They'd call it colonialism. They'd say it's the worst type of influence peddling that exists. I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars that are being doled around the world to various departments if they pass X or Y policy. I mean, if I had that kind of money, I would love to go to, country X and Y and get them to legalize cannabis and sports gambling and to make sure that we have modernized alcohol policy. I would love that. But that's not what's happening here. What they're doing is they're going around the world, Michael Bloomberg specifically, and stating, hey, you can get this beautiful, shiny carrot if you just pass a soda tax, because #health. When in reality, what we see, and it's much the same in Cook County and Illinois, we've seen it in Philadelphia, when you pass these soda taxes, it just means that prices go up for consumers who want those products. And at the very worst, they just go to the next jurisdiction. They go to the next state over, the next county line. They'll go to the next city. And these are the kind of things that happen in all municipalities in all states. And for the billionaire who's interested in saving the world, I get that impulse and I understand it. And I think creative entrepreneurs who become billionaires have provided our societies with great richness, with great products, and we love that. However, when you start getting into the field of depriving people of their choices, that's where we're going to have a problem. Because when you deprive people of choices in one area, you're basically stating, we do not trust you enough to make your own decisions. And social trust in that way, individual rights in that way, are something that are very paramount in liberal democracies. But it's not something that is always held up in the highest of regards in many of these developing countries, and they're taking advantage of that. And again, if it were any other cause, if it was any other billionaire, there would be headlines, people would be screaming about it. We would never hear the end of it. But because it has to do with putting additional taxes on your, big bubbly guzzly drink, or perhaps trying to restrict your vape product, then we don't hear about it. And I think it's fairly unfortunate, because there's a lot of that that's being missed and a lot of lives that otherwise would be saved. And I think that's the most problematic aspect.
I'd like to ask you, what role do you think is played by these people? I mean, they tend to sort of speak as if they're they're doing this in a caring way. They care for us. But how much of it is actually just a bit of control? They maybe don't like the choices of people who are generally less well off, and they would prefer they didn't drink those big, sodas, and they prefer they didn't vape. And how much of that is really maybe just a form of snobbery and elitism, really, that they just don't like the choices that some people make and would like to change those choices. And they dress all this up in as if they're caring for people rather than taking their choices away.
I mean, it's nothing more than paternalism, and I think the Brits are very good at using the term nanny state. And that is a lot of what this is about. It's, we can make those decisions better than you. If only you listen to us, we have all the right answers. If only you listen to us, everything would be fine and dandy. That completely abridges all of our individual rights to make our own decisions. And in a way, we have to learn and fail. I mean, I'm a young dad now. I'm learning how to raise my daughter and soon second daughter. And you have to teach them, but also you have to teach them so that they learn on their own. You can't just make all the decisions for them. They have to have a framework for how the world works. What are the consequences of bad decisions? And which decisions can you take on your own? Why do we all of a sudden delete this when it comes to various products on a governmental or a global stage? I don't understand that. And I think it is a lot about paternalism. A lot of it is about just general control, because the more that they can do this, the more they can turn around to friends, they can get awards. I mean, someone like Bloomberg wins awards every 2 years for some various tax or some group that he funded. Again, who's coming up with these awards? I don't think ordinary people would ever think of this at all, particularly if they would know all the products that they're being deprived. I mean, there are so many cases that we're trying to follow each and every week, but sometimes it's very difficult. Places that don't have things like the sharing economy have no chance of having a vape industry, will never see legal cannabis in their lifetimes. And a lot of that has to do with external pressure from many of the people who say, we know what's best for you. And the more we can push back on that, and the more we can actually inform people that they actually have some rights here and they can make their own decisions, I think it's going to bode very well. We already see that. That's why a lot of this history is very rich in countries like the UK and the United States, because we have very high levels of civil society engagement. We've had that for a long time. You don't have that in many parts of Eastern Europe. You don't have that in many parts of Africa or many parts of Asia. And I think that's also a problem too, is you don't actually have those balances of institutions that we have in liberal democracies.
You know, we finally gave, you know, a lot of these countries were colonies of various, you know, powers. And it's almost like we gave them, oh, you're your own country now, but now we're going to come back in and tell you what's best for you. I mean, I've always thought about like Africa, how they won't let Africa exploit their land for energy. And I'm like, what? So you guys, so all these other countries ruin the environment or whatever the argument is on this one, but you've pretty much owned these countries for, you know, centuries, and now you're not going to let them get into the 21st century. I've always thought that was, you know, just so wrong. I mean, I understand what they're trying to do, but at the same time, you're really just limiting people. And it was funny with Martin would mention about, you know, this paternalist thing. I don't know if any of you guys know this. When Bloomberg was mayor of New York City, he did petition the federal government to bar food stamp recipients from purchasing sodas with those. It didn't go through and everything, and because that's a very, you know, you're just stigmatizing people at this point, and everything. So it's just, but it's very paternalistic. He's been doing it, you know, since he was mayor. I couldn't imagine being an employee for him, quite honestly.
And that kind of welfare paternalism is something that you usually find from the right wing, from conservatives. You know, they don't want people using, you know, their welfare stance for X or Y products or doing this. I mean, that it's typically a restrictionist approach from the right. But we really see that this has nothing to do with party. It has nothing to do with ideology. It's really just a paternalism overall kind of mentality. And I think that's the most problematic, because we're just deleting all of the different preferences that people have, all the different choices people can make. Are people going to make bad decisions? Of course. That's the entire point of having a kind of market system in which people succeed, some people fail, and we try to find the best solution. But if we're just holding people back constantly, holding their hand, not allowing them to make their own decisions, we're just not going to end up with a society that's very happy, not one that's very innovative, and surely one that's not going to provide well-being for millions of people. And I think that's where too much of it is lost. And there's a lot of the ivory tower rhetoric that I think you could use here, that a lot of it has to do with people who just don't understand what it's like for people who are working class or people who might be people of color who don't have the same opportunities. And all of a sudden, we're just restricting their ability to buy this product or use this service. This stuff harms, as always, the people of the less amount of means. And I think that's, again, another example of this kind of machine going awry and depriving so many good people of many opportunities they'd otherwise have.
I think you're right on that, and also on the regulating of these products. We found with harm reduction, the WHO and the European Union both talking about regulations for harm reduction products, and they don't actually understand the products or the people who use them. So it seems very odd that you got these big organizations who seem entitled, or they seem to think they're entitled to take away choices from people when they don't actually realize how these products are being used.
Yeah, and that's the greatest part about, I think, what we get to do is we actually get to go to vape shops. We actually get to go to many of these places where people buy products and sell them. And you actually talk to individuals who use them. You know, this is not an academic argument that's taking place in a university hall. These are people's actual lives. And to actually see how they've been impacted and to see how their lives have changed, I think that's worth, you know, 1 million different public consultations that a World Health Organization or national body would do. And that's what many of these institutions don't have. And that's why I don't always use the nationalistic, you know, American ideal of having government closest to the individual, but we need that in these circumstances. And that's the problem with many of these institutions and organizations is they've basically grown way too out of touch. There's no way that they were able to actually get ordinary voices from ordinary people who might be impacted by some restriction or some regulation that they're pushing. I mean, we talk all the time about vaping and how things are under threat. but they're looking at the food industry as well. There are huge pushes for agriculture. They're not allowing African countries to have the same level of modern agriculture that we've had in the West. They're not allowed to use pesticides the same way we are. They're not allowed to use GMOs the same way that we are. It's this kind of stuff that really makes you think about who is being impacted here. And unfortunately, those people don't always have Twitter accounts. These people don't always have email addresses of all the government ministers. And that's why it's up to civil society groups to stand up for them and to say, hey, actually, this is wrong. This is actually harming people and will actually cause more harm in the long run. And that's why we need to have innovation, and we need to allow people to be free and make their own decisions. I mean, at some point, I would hope.
Yeah, and in contrast to your approach, Yael, is the fact that groups like the WHO, they actively do everything they can to stop consumers talking to them. They don't go down and talk to consumers. They actively stop consumers talking to them. It's astonishing.
Yeah, they have the famous Article 5.3 Framework Convention of Tobacco Control. That's this entire idea that anyone who is a stakeholder of any other group or industry is not allowed to speak to the World Health Organization. It's incredibly bogus. It really doesn't make sense. Any other issue that we have that people lobby on, whether it be in London, whether it be in Washington, there's some issue that's going to be legislated on. Let's say cryptocurrencies. You bring the stakeholders together. You bring together the companies, the users, the banks, the financial services. You bring them all together and they say, what is the best approach here? They hear voices from all different sides, and then they try to make some kind of cost benefit analysis. We don't have that in the world of public health because they believe they are the only arbiters of what is true, of what is correct, and what the actual policy should be, not even thinking about how it will impact ordinary people, not even thinking about farmers and entrepreneurs and hundreds of thousands of vape shop owners, let's say, who've built an entirely new career based on something that saved their life. And now because, someone read a very flawed study somewhere in Sweden at the World Health Organization, now all of a sudden they're deprived of that. That's really what's so problematic about this, and why we need to have groups that focus on these issues, that highlight them and make them relevant for everyday people. Because it's very easy to get lost in all the different acronyms and different meetings. And I mean, even if I'm doing this full time, I have a hard time tracking the newest regulation that's about to come out and restrict someone's freedom. But people do need to be standing up, and we have to work with other groups in order to really promote that.
I'd also like to add that one thing that really does concern me sometimes is that this is almost fashionable now. The nanny state, as you said, the nanny statists, they're almost proud of it. That I've heard there was a lady in Ireland, I think she's a politician, an MP in Ireland, who was once trying to, I don't know if she succeeded, she tried to take away the music from ice cream vans in Ireland because they said it would attract children to eating ice cream. It's one of the most miserable policies you could possibly think of. But when people call her a nanny statist, she would say she was proud to be a nanny statist. She was proud of it, as if she was really happy to be a nanny statist and to be described as a nanny statist, because it's almost fashionable for that. She acts like that.
Another parallel is everything related to housing policy, and you have the NIMBYs and the YIMBYs, the not in my backyard types, very much against all future development in their neighborhoods. And I wouldn't say it's a paternalistic aspect for them. It's just, well, I don't want this in my backyard. I don't want this in my neighborhood. And while they do that, they're depriving so many people of different apartment buildings, of different homes they could have, office buildings. And there's just so much that's stopped by people who have various incentives. And that's where we really have to understand that if we're thinking about the whole system, if we're thinking about people's individual choices, there are going to be people who are upset, no doubt. But what is the ultimate goal? And the ultimate goal, is it just about having every single person in the world stop smoking, not have cannabis, not drink a soda drink? You're not going to achieve that. There's no way. We've tried to eradicate this stuff in the past. We had prohibition in the United States for many years, and it just failed monstrably. And too many of these will. So we have to really think about what are the incentives that people have. It's the normal narrative of the bootleggers and the Baptists. I wouldn't demonize anyone in this process because I think everyone has their own incentives. for pushing various policies or thinking various ideas. It's just incumbent upon us to come up with the better argument and to really try to stand up for the person who otherwise doesn't have an opportunity to participate in the debate or even the conversation.
Awesome. Well, while we get to wrapping up here, Yael, can you kind of, I guess, give us a rundown of the issue areas that you guys are focused on, like right now, and maybe like some calls to actions that any viewers and how they can get participate?
Sure. I mean, there's a large push right now. As we all know, we saw what was happening with a lot of the Congress and the Senate in the United States with infrastructure bill. So obviously broadband is a huge concern. Any kind of centralization of power when it comes to how anyone is going to get internet is probably going to fail and not be very good. So we're trying to keep an eye on all the different bills that are going through Congress, even though it's very difficult. I would just say another area we didn't even talk about are a lot of COVID restrictions that are fairly nonsensical, that actually impact people's lives more than the virus ever could. And something that I think they're becoming too hot politically to touch. But it's very difficult. There's all of the draconian policies in Australia that are happening right now. I mean, this is just next level. And many of these things, we have to understand, many of these powers don't just magically go away once the pandemic is over. They will stay. So that's one that's fairly important. There's always a call to action on everything related to harm reduction and vaping, flavor bans that are being enacted in various states and countries. Seeing the money trail of those who are pushing that, I think, is very important. And realistically, continuing to push the narrative that consumers matter, that you matter, that because you are enjoying an awesome product that the market has delivered, you should not be demonized. You should be encouraged. And we should have more of these options as much as possible. There are many people like you who might be thinking that, who don't get that opportunity every day. But there's so many issues to work on. If you're interested in any of that, obviously Taxpayers Protection Alliance does a great job. You can follow us, Consumer Choice Center, continuing to push this message wherever we can and in many languages. And we'll see what we meet. It's a long battle, but glad to have at least you two as allies in this.
Oh, thank you. Hey, and thanks for joining us today. Martin, do you have any last thoughts?
No, just exactly right. It is a long battle. I always say politics is a long game. Prohibitionists will carry on for decades on the same subject until they get their way, and somewhere, day or night, there is someone in this world every single minute of the day or night trying to prohibit something. So we're glad that you're here, the Consumer Choice Centre, to represent consumers, because consumers will find it very difficult to fight these masses of people who just want to restrict their products.
Exactly. We think smart.
And for the consumers. And well, thanks for both of you guys for joining us today. Listeners, thank you for joining us. For our listeners and viewers, actually, thank you for joining us for another episode of Across the Podcast. Now, thank you, David Williams, for messing that up for me. You can check out more videos on our YouTube page and our Facebook. And thanks again.